Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Rewild New Jersey podcast. I am your host, Francesca Mundrick. I am the founder of Rewild New Jersey Community Cooperative. Joining me today is my very special guest, Jason Kahn. I'm very excited to have Jason. Jason is a lifelong wildlands enthusiast, environmental advocate, and educator. He chiefly focuses on the Adirondack Mountains in the Northeast, wildlife issues in the Northeast, and rewilding. Jason taught earth science and physical science for over 30 years in Chatham, New York, before retiring to Amherst, Massachusetts. And most significantly, Jason actually currently serves as the board president of the Rewilding Institute, super cool organization that we're going to learn about today. Jason and I connected through the channels of the Rewilding world. I reached out and he's been a great resource to me. So I'm very excited to host this episode and to pick Jason's brain about rewilding. I'm going to turn it over to Jason now with my first question. Hi, Jason. Welcome. Tell us first about the work of the Rewilding Institute.
Okay, well, thank you, Francesca, and it's a pleasure to be here. So the Rewilding Institute started probably late 90s by Earth First co-founder Dave Foreman and a couple of his friends, including his wife, Nancy Morton, neither of which are with us anymore, unfortunately. Dave was the first executive director. Currently, that is Turtle Southern. And what the Rewilding Institute has been doing, we're pushing for large-scale core wilderness reserves and corridors, wildlife corridors, wild lands corridors to connect one large core reserve to the next. So wide-ranging carnivores in the continent have the freedom to move from one location to another based on seasonality, climate change, fires, things like that. We want to give them the best chance for long-term survival, both on the terrain and genetically. Some of these carnivores we're talking about, their gene pools have been diminished over the centuries due to hunting, trapping, poisoning, things like that. And so we're trying to get these wide-ranging populations in an area where they can meet, commingle, and spread some of that wonderful genetic diversity about amongst them.
Perfect. Awesome. And noting that the Appalachian Mountains are actually looked at as one of the most premier and significant corridors for wildlife in the world, correct? For like megafaunas and for migratory behavior.
Certainly in the East, it is very, and it's funny because, the Appalachian Trail in the Appalachian Mountains, the Appalachian Trail is a national scenic trail. So the
Mhm.
buffer on it is about 1,000 feet wide. The trail itself does not have any organic protection. What it does have is human love and support, and people love that trail. It is traveled widely every year. So even when the trail gets moved due to development or mining or something like that, electrical right of ways, things like that, the trail does get rerouted, and that 1,000-foot buffer across it goes with it. So they'll just rewild whatever is there. So although it has difficulties, there are road crossings, probably far too many. And it's not the road crossings per se that is the problem. It's the nature of the road crossings. They're literally white stripes on the road and you kind of cross it. And so it's not so much a hassle for human beings. It's probably the easiest and the cheapest way to do it. It is a problem for animals that try to cross. Sometimes it's like 6-lane highways and that becomes a difficulty. But there are workarounds about that we can get in later on. And
Sure.
so
Yeah.
the Appalachian corridor is a great example of what we would talk about in terms of, because there are wilderness areas in North Carolina and Georgia and even in Florida south of the Appalachian Trail and all up along the Northeast. The Appalachian Trail doesn't go into the Catskills, which has several nice wilderness areas, and it doesn't go into the Adirondacks either. But when it goes into the state of Vermont and New Hampshire, there are wilderness areas there, and Maine has a few that are coming around. So things look fairly good there. There are places that we can make improvements, but yeah, and we're trying to mimic that in the West with things like the Mogollon Rim Trail. We're pushing forward, starting with the National Recreation Trail that would connect the Gila Wilderness Complex in New Mexico with the Grand Canyon Complex up in northwestern Arizona. So we're looking at about a 350-mile trail that would connect that and have a groundswell of human support. So the Mexican gray wolf population in the Gila has connectivity to the Grand Canyon complex, and also the wolf population that was recently released in the Gunnison area of Colorado, because there's a corridor that would connect those two. So there'd be intermixing of populations, and it's important to have wolves on the ground there. In the east, I would say beaver are probably just as important due to their role in enhancing biodiversity. There are only two species on the planet that really engineer the landscape. One is humans, and the other ones are beavers. When humans do it, population of wild creatures and biodiversity tends to decrease. When beavers do it, population of wildlife and the biodiversity tend to increase. So we have a lot to learn from the beaver in the east.
Yeah, awesome. That was a great way to answer that question. You just had me churning on so many different things. First of all, in regards to the Appalachian region in the Northeast, like coming from New Jersey and you, Massachusetts, we have two states that are right at the center of a lot of that connectivity, especially in the
Hmm.
Northeast. So especially in like the Northeast corner, making sure that megafaunas that are moving in that area still have connectivity to the major highway of the Appalachians. You made a really interesting note, though, about the Appalachian Trail being used by people and safeguarded for recreative use. And then you said it again about the West and kind of attaching some of those recreative trails to uh, essentially create corridors and cores and pathways for wildlife. And it made me think of the significance of how protected areas that are used by people, like we've talked about rails on trails, for instance, before,
Hmm.
or trails on rails, or whichever way
Rail
that goes.
trails, yeah.
Rail to trails, yeah, like rail to trails, like reestablishing previously used railways and pathways to make connectivity for biking, hiking, walking for people. That inherently creates a wildlife pathway and zone where there's biodiversity existent. So I think that linkage is interesting. I've certainly thought of it, but I've never thought of it on such a grand scale, like how you were discussing the buffer of the Appalachian Mountains and the protections that are on it because people use it. That was interesting, for sure. So anyway, we'll draw on some of those things that you were discussing. My next question was having you just define rewilding, but you're already pulling in some of those ideas regarding cores, corridors, and megafaunas. I also like that you highlighted the wolf out west and the beaver as a pioneer of rewilding as two keystone species here. So I'll add to this question. I would love for you to share just a definition of rewilding, but also maybe continue to share if you have additional notes about key megafaunas that are significant for specifically the Northeast.
Okay, so rewilding is a tough word to nail down by definition. There was that which was first described by Dave Foreman, and then it's been changed somewhat. There's rewilding in Great Britain, which has different meanings. It's more of a getting drainages connected and basically making farms more wildlife friendly, which
Hmm.
is great, and it is important. And anything they can do to make agriculture and animal habitat coalesce, we are all for that. In the North American continent, the rewilding is returning plants, animals, insects to their native habitat and trying to make it so the neighboring human population comes to understand what we're doing and why, and basically have acceptance and tolerance for those things. Some places it's easy, and some places it's a bit more difficult. But it's basically restoring the habitat and the animals and plants that belong on those. In some places in the Midwest, it'll be restoring short and tall grass prairies to their original habitat, perhaps getting bison back on the landscape. In the east, it might be getting wolf and mountain lions to return from where they're currently. The nearest habitat for wolves is in Algonquin National Park up in Canada, up in Ontario, and mountain lions probably from the Midwest or slightly farther west than probably in the Manitoba area of Canada. And so we're looking at things like that. And every once in a while, one wanders into the area, and there's usually a big kerfuffle over this thing. But most of them, wolves and the mountain lions, they're basically lone males moving through trying to find a mate that is unsuccessful because what you need is a breeding population, and these wide-ranging males that kind of get kicked out of their family habitat because family dynamics in a wildlife population. There's only room for one adult male there, so that's what they do. And yeah, so I mean, there are aspects of rewilding that going to require human help. Getting wolves and mountain lions back into, say, the Adirondacks or the Green Mountains or the White Mountains of New England will require some human help, both politically and perhaps even technologically, restoring some habitat where it might need help. They're certainly capable of getting in on their own. One probably easier than the other. There have been wolves in the Adirondacks in the past 5 years, I think two or three of them. And yeah, so getting them back and keeping them here is going to be the tricky part. There's a lot of misunderstanding. I mean, basically, they're just wild dogs. People love dogs. So I don't see what the issue is. It's like, but then again, I'm not a rancher, so that probably explains it.
It's funny how that happens, huh? Yeah, and
Hmm.
I think I recently in episode one interviewed Tony Whitbread, who is an influential figure in England in the rewilding community with the Wildland Sussex Wildland Trust. And he too, in defining rewilding, it's not a vague definition. It just encompasses many things, many layers, and it's still evolving. And so I find that a lot of rewilders discuss primarily restoration, lower management, right? Like not over managing
Yeah.
ecology, but letting biodiversity drive balance. What you're saying a lot, your themes are habitat connectivity, megafauna, reintroduction, making sure that we have vibrancy in the habitats and the connections to them. So I get a lot of different definitions, and you are correct in saying that rewilding is also applied differently depending on where you go and what the needs are, which has been communicated to me a lot as well. In Europe, for instance, they might be starting their ecological restoration from essentially a lower level. Like their biodiversity is lower, their needs are different, their landscapes are different. We still have wilderness availability and biodiversity, but we're attempting to preserve that and make it stronger as we start
Hmm.
to move into the future, right? And our human societies change. How can we create better balance between humans and the environment, humans and wildlife? How can we make sure that we keep the biodiversity and the essential resources and have more connectivity to them again in the future? So all of those things I think kind of pack together. This leads me to my next question for you. Um, for thinking about the US and thinking about how we interact with ecological restoration, there's a lot of movements on specifically the reestablishment of native plants, supporting insects, de-emphasizing or removing or decreasing the use of pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers to boost biodiversity, supporting birds. So I feel like those narratives and those ideas are very heavy in ecological restoration, and I feel that it's because people can touch that and do that actionably really easily. So how does rewilding in the U.S. interpretation of ecological restoration fit in? Like, do you think that the practice of it for day-to-day people is different or the same? What are your thoughts on that?
Um, so ecological restoration, and let's take a look at for my limited mind space available to this. We can talk about around human population centers. We can talk about agriculture, and we can talk about more open, say, rangelands, national forests, BLM land, things like that. So in the human populated areas where there's dense human population, we can talk about the Miami to Boston corridor, for example. Most of that population density is situated in cities with suburbs surrounding them. My home on as a child was in Long Island, Suffolk County, and now it's like Long Island has a population that's equal in size to New York City. So it's a big area there, but still there are deer, there are turkey, there are coyotes down there, and they manage to be doing all right. So in like rewilding in a densely populated human area, probably the best place to start is along your waterways. Get them cleaned up, get them connected. Uh, if you have dams on them, see about removing a lot of the dams in the Northeast are derelict dams. They were abandoned post-colonialism. And those things, once you remove them, fish are able to come back from the oceans and travel inland. When you clean up the shorelines and remove the insults to it, people start using those areas more. When you plant more trees along these waterways, and they've been used as very cheap uh, waste disposal conduits for hundreds of years in the United States. So basically, once we start cleaning those up, animals can use those as corridors because if there's greenery on the side, it gives them shade, it gives them cover, and it surrounds water. People start using them. People will return to fishing, they'll return to hiking, canoeing, or kayaking in them, whatever the size of the stream would permit. And a lot of these small hiking trails along some of these populated areas uh, in and on the outskirts of the city are very popular with humans. And at night, they're very important for wildlife corridors. For migratory birds, for animals moving up and down along their territory, trying to forage food. In the agricultural states, if we look at, say, the Mississippi Flyway, Minnesota, all the way down to Louisiana. On each side of the Mississippi, you've got real intense agricultural use. In some of these states, 99% of the land area in a state is used for either residential or agricultural use. So there's very little of these things that has been preserved as parkways. But the flyway along there, if they can keep the Mississippi River banks stabilized, helps with erosion too, with a buffer of trees, 100 or so feet wide. It keeps the water cooler, keeps the water from evaporating that fast, and will still allow for boat traffic up and down the Mississippi. But it also allows for the animals using that flyway to fly from one safe area to the next, to the next. And as they move down south, those areas, if they're connected, will give flocks of different types of birds places to recollect and then forage for food and then move on the next day. And in the spring, it just moves north. And it also allows for bear and coyote and bobcat to move up and down those areas looking for squirrels, chipmunks, rabbits, things like that, something to eat, nuts, berries. And it allows them to use that corridor in a place that you wouldn't really associate with a lot of wildlife, which is the Midwest, which is surprising because there is a lot of wildlife in the Midwest. It's just, yeah, there's no big centers for wildlife viewing in the Midwest, so that will happen. And if we're looking at the Western United States, the Intermountain West, once the federal lands there were used for, say, the Bureau of Land Management. basically multi-use lands that allow for cattle grazing. Uh, they do mining on it. They will do logging on it. They will do things like, if there are permits, uh, almost anything, as long as it adheres to the Bureau's purview, what their goals are. And in the Forest Service, they have pretty much the same thing. They're allowed to graze cattle in the national forest, and even in some places in wilderness areas where they're not supposed to be, but they get grandfathered in there. And the problem with the West, once you cross the 100th or the 105th meridian, the line of longitude, water becomes more scarce and agriculture becomes more dependent upon uh, irrigation. And places without proper irrigation are having real difficulty maintaining their rangeland for cattle grazing. Um, for instance, if you take the state of Vermont, in good habitat, you can put 40 head of cattle on 1 acre and they'll do fine and not overgraze it.
Mhm.
You move to, say, Western Colorado, Utah, uh, you can put one head of cattle on 400 acres, and it's right on the edge of overgrazing there because the forage is so sparse, and it's hard for these cattle to get a decent meal out there, which is why they tend to be more kind of rangy, and they require more um, different kind of food in order to kind of put proper fat marbling on them, things like that. And to supplement this, the Forest Service, the BLM, has been planting exotic grasses that displace the uh, native grasses because they might be more nutritious, but they don't do the job the native grasses did, which was soil stabilization. In some of these places, it's just really thick silt soil, not rich in nutrients. And yeah, it's just a bad spiral in terms of biodiversity goes. The cattle will eat what they like most, which are probably going to be these non-native plants, and because the cattle themselves are non-native here, they're Eastern European, Western Asian. But so it's there's issues that would require a lot of political will in order to kind of fix, especially in the West. In the East and the Midwest, I don't think it'd be that difficult. But the crux here is that most of the big open connected uh, habitat is in the
Mhm.
West, and that's a difficult point.
It's
Sorry
it's
if I'm
funny.
rambling
It's
here.
funny you say that because people assume that the East is less wild, overdeveloped, densely populated, industrial, right? And it's like the West is looked at as this super wild landscape, like, it's looked at as idealistic, beautiful, right? But when I think about the West and some of the things you're bringing up, a lot of people don't understand how disjointed things really are, and it's because of what comes to mind for me is like obviously the mass agriculture, but like also the mass ranch lands. And I feel like between the national parks, while there's certainly wilderness out west, like, well, the Western wilderness is amazing, there is a good amount of fragmentation out west too that people don't realize because of how we use the land, right?
Yeah,
So that's something that's a little bit misunderstood, I feel, day to day, with most people studying ecological restoration or rewilding. The West has just as much challenges as the East. It's just different challenges. And I
very,
think that
very
you're
well
right.
put.
Yeah, I think that you're right that the East is borderline almost easier to rewild because we do have our history is different, our land use is different, and our capabilities are different. And so I think that the frontier here is borderline not not better, but like maybe what you're saying, like a little easier to get started and a little easier to connect.
Hmm.
Which is interesting. It's like people would think that the West is like super wild and like maintained, but really it's actually just as fragmented, but in a different way. Um, So this leads me to my final question. And you're kind of already hitting the notes of it. Certainly with Rewild New Jersey, I am focusing on community approaches, community organizing, modeling community rewilding for restoring nature, but also for transforming people. So I think that people are part of the whole. So I have community rewilding as a model. One side of that model is conservation rewilding, which is what we've been discussing, mainly focused on restorative actions, ecological restoration, protections, the three C's, right? All of that stuff. But the other side of the coin is human rewilding, which is looking at the psyche of society, how people interact with their local environments, reestablishing perhaps resilience and self-sufficiency. I believe that community rewilding and practice as a whole hits those notes in different ways. And that the main goal of it is really sovereignty, right? Like building back a world where we have better connectivity, um, cleaner environments, right? More resources, more accessibility. So all of those things are part of my personal work with this. I'm a geographer, so I think about sociology a lot and like why things are the way that they are and why things are spatially the way that they are, why people do the things that they do, what our culture means. So I bring all of that stuff into rewilding in my mind. I'm a PhD student. I don't own like a lot of land to rewild it physically, so I try to rewild through the people. That brings me to this idea of scalable rewilding, which has been taking hold, I feel like, for at least 5-10 years already in the rewilding discipline. This idea that rewilding is any net gain of biodiversity can be applied in what we've been discussing, urban, suburban, or rural communities or places and spaces. When we talk about scalable rewilding and orienting rewilding for communities, what are some things that come to mind for you?
Okay. First of all, anything you can do on your property. I live in a suburban neighborhood in Amherst, Mass, and there's lots of wildlife in the area, thanks in part due to the fact that we have a nice swamp out back. And I say that knowing a lot of people think of swamps as being like, ugh, all the mosquitoes, but it's actually quite lovely. And we have the Quabbin to the east of us here, and so we have a natural corridor coming right through there. Maintain those connective places where you can, and all they really need is ground cover and shade and not to be out in the open for too long. And in the places near me, we have moose, we have bear, we have bobcat, coyotes. We don't have as many deer as like when I lived in New York State, we had deer everywhere. Columbia County was like the second highest deer population in New York State. That being said, we have a lot of deer here, but they manage to stay hidden during the day, and I'll see them crossing the rail trail in the twilight areas, or you'll see them out in far fields as I'm riding bikes along some dirt roads and things like that. But you don't see a lot of deer during the day here. They usually do a lot of their moving at night. So
Mhm.
these small little connectivity places that connect, in a residential area, you can have little small community woodlands. And in places where you can, those things should be protected. It helps replenish water into the groundwater supply. I'm from Long Island, and they're literally trying to pave almost everything down there, which is keeping water from entering back into what was once the largest aquifer in the East. Uh, and so keeping these small places protected and connected is important. And that's where the idea and the burgeoning science of road ecology is so important. Uh, what road ecology does is it looks to see where wildlife is crossing roads. And it's not that complicated. If you really look at it, it all makes sense. They're not crossing between farmland and farmland. They're crossing between protected habitat and protecting habitat. And you can tell that's where they're crossing. Of course, that's where we find roadkill, which is the dark underbelly of the science of rewilding. You learn by looking at where animals have been run over. That being said, many communities are putting underpasses for wildlife under the roads. They can be uh, culverts that would allow for something like a deer to pass under it. If you have a concrete one, having a little ledge along the base where, say, a coyote or a deer or a bobcat can cross there, that makes a big difference instead of just those steeply sloped angles where hoofed animals are going to have difficulty walking through that. Uh, and in some places, overpasses where the Appalachian Trail crosses Interstate 90 in western Massachusetts. Right now, there's just a footbridge 12 feet wide crossing all four lanes of Interstate 90. Within 5 years, that will be expanded until it's more than 50 yards wide. There'll be a meter or so of soil planted on it, and they'll be planting bushes and trees and putting rocks there to make it look like it's natural habitat. And this way, we won't have deer and bear being killed when they're trying to cross the interstate. And again, that buffer around the Appalachian Trail is so important there. Uh, and we just need to expand that thing because right now, very few animals would use that corridor because it looks like a trap right now because it's 100 yards long and 12 feet wide, and there's no way to get out of that in case a human comes in the other end or so. So that's ways to do this. In North Amherst, Mass, years ago, there were spotted salamanders that would migrate in the spring across Station Road. And they were getting squished, and spotted salamanders are just adorable. They're 6 inches long with these beautiful yellow spots on them, and they're slow moving. They're just lovely creatures, and they're somewhat endangered. So people did a lot of pushing of the local political scene, and they went out there and put in sweat equity, creating these corridors to channel these animals into these small little culverts beneath the road, and they put slotted plates on the top that are only about 6 inches wide, but it allows enough light to come through that the spotted salamanders will crawl through there in their spring migration, and they have it in 2 or 3 places along the road there. That's one of the oldest applications of road ecology that I know of. The stuff they've done out in Banff, which is in Alberta and in British Columbia, they have these huge wildlife crossings in California where was it C99 was this world famous mountain lion that lived up near the Hollywood Hills, had its own Instagram account, or at least his people had an Instagram account for him. They had this huge project that they're funding where they're going to be building a wildlife corridor over, I think, 10 lanes of traffic on, I don't remember is it Interstate 10 or something out there? No, it would have to be an odd number because it's running north-south. Anyway, big project they're doing that just to make these things work better for animals and humans. And when you talked about rewilding humans, which is where this thing has got to begin, Chris Tompkins, the head of Tompkins Conservation Fund, she has said when she starts her talks, the first thing we need to rewild is ourselves. And we have success stories there. When you hear about how frequent mountain lion sightings are in the Intermountain West, there were years went by when that was not happening whatsoever because mountain lions would just, if they saw a human, they either died or they disappeared and tried to not to find them anymore. But something changed in the past 15 years. And what changed was us. We became more tolerant of these animals. We began to see them as what they are, not so much threats, but just wondrous creatures who are surviving. They don't want to be persecuted by humans, but they also don't want to interact with us in a positive way. And the problem when we have negative interaction between mountain lions in the West And humans is when we kill a mother or a father of a young male or female cub who would have taught them, one, to avoid us when they can, and how to hunt properly. And that does not include hunting humans. So by keeping that institutional knowledge in the family and not removing that, the children will learn to avoid human beings and their children will learn to avoid human beings. It's when you remove the adults there. Sometimes it's getting hit by cars, which is all too frequent, but sometimes it's just humans hunting them because we tend to shoot things that we either don't appreciate or we don't understand.
Yeah. Um, this makes me think as well of interacting with teaching rewilding, right? Even for youth. And I think that a large base of that is teaching them about like utilizing their spirit, connecting their spirit to nature connectedness, place-based stewardship, being looking at nature as valuable, intrinsically valuable. But I think maybe a big dialogue in there is what you're discussing, teaching young people to value wildlife and see wildlife as keeping that going, that environmental literacy going. That has been, I agree with you. I feel that the environmental literacy and education has exponentially gone up since probably about the 80s or 90s, right? Like around then, that's when we really started to harden a lot of those narratives. Um, yeah, so and I think that the applications you're talking about are so valuable, especially when we think about uh how we apply these ideas in different spaces and how humans and people can interact with them themselves. So this has been an absolutely amazing talk. You gave really, really great information. And it's even helping me through these interviews. And part of the reason why I'm doing a podcast like this is to just gain knowledge to inform my own writing and to inform Rewild New Jersey to add more clarity to our resources and help people understand like how to apply these ideas. So this has been totally awesome, and I thank you so much for joining me. We have plenty of a conversation. We have a great conversation here to share.